When Gabe asked me if I knew anyone who would want to give a presentation about Monsignor Romero, I was like, hello, me. In my household, the figure of Romero is held with the highest regard. We've got numerous images and books of him all over the place. Not to mention the fact that as soon as we heard about his canonization, we made it a point to purchase flights to Rome with Mom and Tias to form part of such a momentous occasion. It was an exciting moment for me, not so much because of the religious part of it all, but rather because I truly believe that the gradual awakening his conciencia experienced throughout his pastorate was the true miracle of his calling. The memory of his transformation is one that gives me hope at a time when incessant pleas for change and a halt to the extractivism, displacement, violence, and grave human rights abuses, including massive genocide, seem to fall on deaf ears. A time when the situation worldwide seems so bleak and helpless. I was about 9 years old when I first watched the film Romero. Mind you, with the PG-13 rating, I was still a tad bit young to watch it. But alas, as was habitual of our Sundays, we sat together as a family in my godparents' tiny living room and watched this much anticipated biopic of an individual that has been a source of courage and hope for Salvadorans worldwide. It was 1990, and the war that unraveled as Romero's life was tragically ended continued as bloody as ever. The film was one of the first sources to present me with context about why my parents and I were living in the US and not in El Salvador. As the elders discussed the flaws of this Hollywood representation of a person that had been so emblematic in their youth, I wanted to know more about an individual who seemed to give so much, and that despite the terror, the threats, and violence he endured in his final years, kept pushing forward, defending the poor, denouncing the human rights abuses, and calling out the military forces, National Guard, death squads to cease the repression once and for all. Nonetheless, this cry for an end to the violence that had engulfed the tiny nation by the 80s was the final appeal, as the following day, March 24th, 1980, Romero's life was ended by a single bullet to the heart as he officiated a private mass in the chapel of the Divine Providence Hospital in San Salvador. The voice of the voiceless had been silenced, but his teachings, his practice, his legacy lived on in the struggle, la lucha del pueblo salvadoreño. Monsignor Oscar Arnulfo Romero Galdames was born on August 15, 1917, in Ciudad Barrio San Miguel. Romero was the second of 8 children. At a very young age, he was certain that what he wanted in life was to become a priest. His sister Zaida recalls, what he enjoyed most as a kid were the processions. He would throw on my mom's apron and go out on the street and call the other kids to join him, already dreaming that he was a priest. At 13, Oscar kept fussing that he wanted to be a priest. So my mom packed up all his clothes and he left, first for the lower seminary in San Miguel, and later for the upper in San Salvador. And then he went to finish his studies in Rome. He lived in that city during the World War, so my brother was absent from the family and Ciudad Barrios for many years. Romero officiated his first Mass in his native Ciudad Barrios on January 11, 1944, at a young 27 years of age. He was loved in his hometown. The people admired his discipline and humility. In Maria López Vigil's book, Piezas para un Retrato, Memories in Mosaic, one follower explains, "Want me to be frank? Father Romero, friend of the poor, and friend of the rich. He would tell the rich, love the poor. And to us, the poor, he would say, love God, as only he knows what he's doing when he puts you last in line. In the end, you'll have access to heaven. And the heaven that he preached to us would only be accessible to the rich that gave charity, and to the poor that did not fight back. Several accounts in Lopez Vigil's book about his early years as a priest describe a serious man devoted to his faith and his pueblo. He opened church doors to the poor, housed them, fed them, clothed them, and even embraced the drunks and the ill-fated, as another narrative suggests. But what did he understand or think about the social injustices that vexed the greater part of the Salvadoran populace during this time? In the first years of his order, he was described as the pastor of the lambs and the wolves, as he remained impartial and disconnected from the country's socio-political reality, perhaps why he was so adored by the wealthy. This is especially evident from the testimonies offered about his work as the parish priest of San Miguel from 1944 to 1967. In effect, the aforementioned narrative that suggests his belief that the poor would enter heaven so long as they did not fight back, and that the rich would access it by giving to the poor, shows that at that particular moment of his personal and professional journey, Romero had not developed a consciousness about why or how to admonish the violent, exploitative, and unjust conditions affecting Salvadorans all around. As a result of the continued reign of the 14 families, a vicious oligarchy that stole lands and controlled most, if not all, of the country's assets. The following account also demonstrates how even 22 years into his order, when he was named auxiliary bishop of San Salvador in 1967, he remained very quiet despite the growing instability the country was experiencing on the political front, and removed himself from spaces within the clergy that were building a resistance effort within the church. I did not like him. He was insignificant, a shadow that spent his time stuck to walls. From the moment he arrived in San Salvador, Father Romero decided to reside at the San Jose de la Montaña Seminary. Who knows why? We, a community of Jesuits, lived there. But he never ate or had dinner or breakfast with us. He would go down to the dining area whenever we weren't there. It was clear that he did everything to avoid us, that he arrived in San Salvador with so many prejudices. We never saw him in any sort of pastoral activity. He did not have a parish and did not attend any of the clergy meetings. And when he did go, he hid in a corner and never opened his mouth. He was afraid to confront the priests that were super active, that were radicalizing their thinking with everything that was going on in the country, which was so much. And he preferred to stay in his office amongst his paperwork, or walking in his black robe, praying around the halls. Shortly after he arrived in San Salvador, we had a pastoral week that was a real shaker-upper. Everything went into high gear and became more radicalized. Plans were laid out, meetings, communities, thousands of things. He remained on the sidelines, and then he took a side. But it was the wrong side. Much was being commented about his relation to some of the Opus Dei priests. He had his own work, which was not ours. He totally started off on the wrong foot. In 1968, just 1 year after being named auxiliary bishop of San Salvador, the Latin American Catholic bishops gathered at Medellin, Colombia. They spoke of the institutionalized sin that afflicted and oppressed the majority of people in Latin America. And they called the whole church to take on a preferential option for the poor. For a long time, Romero wanted nothing to do with this. He squelched community-based pastoral projects that he felt were too radical. He protected the status quo. And boy, did he ever protect the status quo. On March 25th, 1972, there was a popular uprising in San Salvador. It was the perfect excuse to declare martial law and establish a curfew throughout the country. The hunt for political opposition was underway, and the repression was ruthless. I was finishing my theology and went to celebrate Holy Week in El Carmen, a small town in San Miguel. The military arrived on Holy Thursday and arrested half a dozen campesinos who were nowhere to be found thereafter. On Holy Saturday, after having been tortured and killed, their cadavers were tossed at the town entrance. I felt myself die of distress and helplessness. On Monday, I went to see the bishop in San Miguel, Eduardo Alvarez, who is also a colonel in the military, with close ties to the military for years. "What do you want me to do?" he asked when I told him about the murders. "I would like you to go to El Carmen to console these people. They need it. They really need it. They asked for this. Now they need to deal with it." That was his only response. I felt even more powerless and outraged that I nearly choked. Since I had known Monsignor Romero for years, I went to San Salvador to talk with him. I told him everything. He seemed disturbed and somewhat hurt by Bishop Alvarez's response. "So will you go to El Carmen?" I dared to ask him. "Of course not. I don't find it prudent to do that." "But Monsignor," "what you should do is go to the nuncio. Tell him what's going on. He should be informed about this." The nuncio was a really good friend of the recently, fraudulently elected President Molina. At the end of the Molina government, after the failure of the agrarian reform, a tremendous repression against campesinos unfolded. And too began the persecution against the church. In February, 4 priests were tortured and expelled from the country as they were foreigners. There were raids and threats against religious folk, a very ugly situation. Monsignor Chavez asked to accelerate the process of his replacement so that his substitute could take on the crisis. When he found out that Monsignor Romero was going to be his replacement, he became very discouraged. After all, he had been his auxiliary for 4 years, and knew very well about his limitations. It's interesting how the Holy See did not take into consideration my recommendation of Monsignor Rivera, who was always my candidate, and they knew it. 40 years as Archbishop, and they did not take my suggestion into consideration. He was hurt. Perhaps those in Rome feared that Rivera, although far from being a combatant, knew how to debate based on his knowledge of the law. This turkey, as they would call Rivera, is a communist and will cause us so many problems. Perhaps in Rome the thinking was that Romero was better because he was easy to manipulate. I share these third-person accounts of Romero's early, careless demeanor with regards to oppression, not as a means to discredit his persona or to antagonize his life's work, but rather to highlight a point a fellow compañero made last month on another anniversary of Monsignor's death. They posted, "He was in his late 50s when he realized he was on the wrong side of history. He chose to be with the people. People can change." I'll say this again. People can change. We just have to have faith in them. Liberation theology in Latin America emerged in response to massive poverty and social injustice. Peruvian theologian Gustavo Gutierrez presented liberation theology as a rationale for performing pastoral work among the poor. The church remained the only force that resisted the military by harboring persecuted individuals. It also served as a mediator between the government and rebel groups. It critiqued the existence of massive poverty and denounced unjust social structures as sinful. Beginning in the late 1960s, in an effort to come closer to the people, thousands of Catholic sisters and priests moved out of traditional convents and religious houses and into poor neighborhoods to share the living conditions of the people. The initial impulse was pastoral rather than directly political. It was partly a recognition that the church's resources had been disproportionately devoted to the middle and upper classes, especially through schools which depended on tuition payments. In their concern to avoid any paternalism, they found the educational approach of concientización, consciousness raising, developed by the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire, to be made to order. Evangelization, quote unquote, evangelization itself was reconceived as group reflection on life experiences rather than as imparting doctrine. To the extent that those leading these group reflections urge people to look for root causes, they had a radicalizing effect. In rural areas, these discussions would often move from immediate problems towards matters such as land tenure, and from there to class structure. Consciousness raising leads naturally to organization. Priests and sisters generally avoided being leaders or spokespersons for the people, but rather sought to stimulate people to form and run their own organizations. While it is true that Monsignor Romero never explicitly regarded himself as a liberation theologian, as he often explained that his preferential option for the poor was driven by his faith rather than ideological currents, at the end of the day, the extreme shift in his praxis and perspective occurred as a result of the monstrosities he witnessed as he assumed the role of Archbishop of San Salvador in 1977, and how the violence began to affect even those closest to him, including himself. His quote-unquote evangelization, or rather his concientización, or rude awakening, following the murders of fellow pastors, including Fathers Rutilio Grande and Octavio Ortiz Luna. The phone rang. It was his good friend, President Molina. "So good to hear from you, President." "Monsignor, I have some news to share with you. I've just been informed of Father Rutilio Grande's assassination near Aguilares." "Rutilio? With my most sincere condolences, I would like to communicate two things to you. The first, that the government had absolutely nothing to do with this occurrence. And the second, that we will carry on a thorough investigation to find the killers." It was midnight when Monsignor Romero arrived to see him dead. He approached the small table where we put him, covered by a white blanket. And he just kept staring at him in a way that proved how much he loved him too. We didn't know Monsignor. It was the first time we heard him preach. When we heard him, much to our surprise, it was Father Grande's voice. That's what we all said. It seemed as though Father Rutilio had transitioned into Monsignor, right there before our eyes. I swear. Could it be that God brought about this miracle so that we would not be orphaned? The death of Father Octavio Ortiz Luna. The Isidro Menendez morgue was famous. That's where the bodies went after they were found on the streets, in the ditches, or in the garbage dumps of San Salvador. There were times when there were 6, 7, 8 of them every day. The garbage truck would pick them up and take them there until someone came to identify them. Sometimes no one came. They were afraid of reprisals. That's where they took Father Octavio and the 4 boys after the National Guard killed them in El Despertar. The news spread quickly through the neighborhood. I went with my father, Beto, who had been a friend of Father Octavio since I was a girl. We went to the morgue looking for our dead. The entrance was totally militarized. Monsignor Romero arrived at the same time we did, and he went in right away, racked with sorrow. Where are they? Where are they? No one stopped him or anything. The guardsmen just looked at him from the door, curious to see the Archbishop going into such a place of ghosts. We went in behind him. The floor was one big puddle of blood. The 5 of them were there thrown on the floor. Streams of blood were still coming out of them. Where is Octavio? Here, Monsignor. This is him. They pointed to him. You couldn't even tell it was him. His body was completely flattened. His face destroyed to the point that it looked like he didn't even have one. I had seen Father Octavio in my house eating with my father so many times, and I couldn't even recognize him. Monsignor knelt on the ground and held his shattered head. It can't be. This isn't him. It's not him. Tears streamed from Monsignor's face as he held him with deep tenderness. I can't believe that they could be so savage, he said. The guardsman looked through the door. Monsignor's cassock was covered with blood, and he was crying, cradling Father Octavio in his arms. Octavio, my son, you have completed your mission. You were faithful. In the end, the point I would really like to make is that it took a long time for Romero to reach a concientización. And what finally made him wake up were the grotesque assassinations of Fathers Rutilio and Octavio and of his pueblo, his people. And of course, the multiple death threats he received that, alas, turned out to be real and tragically ended his life. And although he was unable to complete his life's mission to defend his pueblo, to denounce the system that was oppressing his people and causing so much pain and misery, post-mortem, he was so much stronger. He is so much stronger. His activism was so much more palpable. He became the soul and conviction of his pueblo, and he truly did resurrect in the Salvadoran people. And right now that we are living such tense moments where we just want to give up and throw in the towel because it just seems that no one is listening or caring, we cannot give up. We have a responsibility to keep uplifting popular education projects and the social movement, because just as we witnessed through Monsignor Romero, the radicalization of minds is possible. It just takes work. Nothing ever comes easy, and oftentimes it can be very intimidating and scary. Compañeros have died doing this work, but all we can do is uphold their legacy and keep pushing forward. Thank you.
Thank you for those words, compa. I think this is a really important moment for us to think about this question about transformation, as we're seeing a lot of what the world that we thought existed really isn't. And what does that mean for each one of us, each one of ourselves? I do a lot of accompaniment work with the dignified Palestinian people and the dignified Zapatista people in Chiapas. And so doing that work at the same time has really had me confront this question of spirituality. And I hadn't been prepared for that, because a lot of the time in our movements on the left and social justice movements, we don't like to talk about religion or spirituality. And a lot of us have a lot of trauma. It's very understandable. And at the same time, we need to talk about it if we're going to talk about how do we build a world where many worlds fit, rather than a world where just one world fits. And so, in thinking about this question of liberation theology and its history to Catholicism, which is a very painful history on these lands, and not just these lands, it's a really great challenge for us to move outside of our comfort zones and in trying to figure out how do we talk about each other's worlds in a way where we can ask this question, how can we share the world together with all of our difference? With Catholicism, we need to, of course, recognize that Catholicism has been a colonial spiritual warfare on these lands. A holy war. Queen Isabella's holy war, who I can only understand as the original Osama bin Laden. Like when this country talks about holy war, they don't talk about 1492. And in 1492, before Columbus reached here, already the Catholic monarchs were ethnically cleansing the Iberian Peninsula of Muslims and Jews and forcing everybody to convert. They had the Inquisition already happening, and it heightened after that. And then January 2nd, 1492 marks that moment. There was also a lot of torture, burning of books. So the things that the Europeans did to the native communities here, they were already doing to each other there. And so then, in thinking of this question of transformation, the story of the liberation theologians, whether they call themselves that or not, that had been raised by the Catholic Church and then learned to humble down and learn from the communities and on these lands, the native communities largely on these lands, and not just learning from them, but living with them, like you described, the importance of sharing the material conditions of poverty. In Chiapas, with the Zapatistas, this is part of a prehistory of the Zapatista, but not an overdetermined history. It's really important to recognize that in speaking about liberation theology in Chiapas, and they say this all the time, it is not to absolve the church at all. It is to recognize the transformation of the priests, of the catechists, and there are very, very clear stories that can help us understand that transformation. And examples of those are when the priests were listening to the confessions of the Tojolabal people in Chiapas, as a specific example. They would hear very strange confessions. For example, the people would say, "Forgive me, Father, I threw the pot. I was not respectful to the pot. Forgive me, Father, I did not visit the milpa. The milpa gets sad when you don't visit her every day." And this was really confusing to them. And the ones that decided to learn were able to then understand that in the Tojolabal cosmovision, everything lives. Everything, including the pot. And therefore, everything must be respected. So there isn't a division between the human and the non-human, where the human has the rights and then the non-human earth has no rights and can be exploited. That itself is the slippery slope of racialization, because not everybody then qualifies as this human who has rights. And that's where we get enslavement and exploitation and this sort of enormous poverty that still exists on these lands. There is a story of a wonderful writer who has transitioned since, and most of his books are in Spanish. And we're trying to translate some of his work. His name is Carlos Lenkersdorf. He was a theologian from Europe who ended up in Mexico, and in the 70s was asked by Samuel Ruiz to translate the Bible into Tojolabal with his partner Gudrun, I believe is her name. I apologize if I'm messing it up. but they didn't know Tojolabal, so they had to learn Tojolabal. And in that learning, the key to it was humility, knowing that one can learn from others who don't have these titles, these degrees, don't even speak, your language or your language, quote unquote, properly. And in that process of learning is how he was able to pull out the cosmovision of the Tojolabal people. And then when we recognize that, then we can start reading in the prayers and the lessons of the catechists under this maybe umbrella that we might call liberation theology of the time of the 70s and the 80s. We can read power. We can read power in the way that the Zapatistas talk to us about power today. So with the liberation theologians, the catechist learns not to impose the word of God on the communities, but to look for the word of God in the everyday practices of the people. The word of God is already there. And how that translates today with Zapatista political theory, as we might call it, is the understanding of power, of different qualities and circulations of power. A lot of the time when they talk about the power that dominates, that imposes, the Zapatistas will capitalize the P, capital P power, power over. And when they talk about the power to create things together, the potentials that we have, they lowercase it to power, lowercase p. And what they want to do in their political project is to never impose a way on anybody. And this is why they don't take the state. And for a lot of leftists, this upsets them. And so the Zapatistas have made a conceptual split for us that there is a left from above and a left from below. And they are the left from below. They are from below and to the left. And this question of left is not a dogma, it's not an ideology, it's an ethical posture against injustice. And so it doesn't have a label. It's an ethical posture against injustice. And this is where the importance of the question of spirituality, of cosmovision, of religion, of ideology, whatever it is that we call it, this question of ethics is so central. And what I have found in trying to understand it myself and understand how do we build a world where many worlds fit, this question of ethics is how do we relate to each other? How do we relate to ourselves? In some of the prayers from Chiapas and lessons and readings at the time in the 70s and 80s, you hear them say, we must not crush others and we must not crush ourselves. So it's at once the other and the self. And the collective, the community is the central force rather than the individual, which is the central force, the central actor under capitalism, especially the individual who under some sort of selfish kind of vibe is supposed to then uplift everybody, and we have seen that does not happen. It's a fantasy, it's a delusion that happens. And at the same time, it's not about making everybody the same in the collective. The Zapatista women say we are equal because we are different, rather than we are equal when we reach a certain standard. When there is a standard to equality like the dominant world that we live in today, introducing a standard introduces inequality. When there isn't a standard for equality, when we begin with the premise that we are already equal, because we are different, what does that mean? It doesn't mean that we tolerate difference. It means that we are powerful because of our differences rather than in spite of our differences. It is understanding that the true biodiversity of the earth, also extends to the biodiversity of the human species. And it is in that diversity where we can be strong. And the collective constellation of difference needs us to be ourselves rather than what somebody else wants us to be. And when we can be ourselves and we can be our unique selves, and in collective, living into our powers and to our gifts, sharing those with others, that is that strength of that diversity, of that difference. Carlos Lenkersdorf's books, probably one of the most famous ones is called Los Hombres Verdaderos, the True Humans. This is from the Tojolabal cosmology. Tojol means true, so it's the language of the true, the people with this whole concept of true. And true is not a static kind of category. True is an instant. And a famous, beautiful example I think we might all be able to relate to is when they call the tortilla, the true tortilla. The true tortilla is the one that just comes off of the comal and has a little steam, and then after like a couple seconds it stops being true. So it's like an aspiration, right? It's so then to be a true human, the Zapatistas talk about how they have a military. Their soldiers are not true humans because they wield a weapon. And wielding that weapon makes it so that might equals right. And that is not a true human. And that is why they fight for a world where there are no armies, so that the soldiers don't have to be soldiers anymore, so that they can just be who they're going to be, who they are. So these kinds of concepts, that book, Los Hombres Verdaderos, was written in the early 90s and was the book that in Mexico people were reading to try to understand the uprising in Chiapas. There's also aprender a escuchar, learning to listen. Right? Not just hearing, but listening. And it's really listening to the heart, like what are you feeling? I know you're saying something, but I can feel that you're feeling something else that you might not be saying. So learning to listen. I'm going to read an excerpt from a chapter called Exodus in Chiapas, that Celtal Catechism of Liberation, Ocosingo, 1972. It's in a book called Rebellion in Chiapas by Womack. And in this chapter, Exodus in Chiapas, there's an introduction of this wave of liberation theology in Chiapas in the 70s. And it also translates, it's in English, it translates songs and lessons and prayers. And so I want to read just one reading that talks about the self and the relationship to money, to capital. In everyday life, in many of our homes and communities, we probably hear que el dinero es el demonio, that money is the devil. So it's something to consider in listening to this text, and not only this text, also in trying to understand why the Zapatistas are anti-capitalist. Capitalism not just being the exchange of goods. Capitalism being a system that thrives off of that division of the human and the non-human. That is, again, a slippery slope, because that human on top is not Homo sapiens. It's a political human. It's the ones who can live up to the standard of what it means to be human. And that is that enormous violence that capitalism continues to reproduce. So this reading. Is it true that we are no longer Indians? Brothers, what I am going to tell you here is what I said with Brother Manuel, who no longer wants to be our Indian brother. Last Sunday, I was walking along, carrying my bag, headed for the colony to go to church with my community. On the road, I met Manuel, who lives on the farm on the other side of the river. He was coming riding his horse, wearing his pants and his new shirt, his good hat and his fine shoes. I said to him, "Good morning, Brother Manuel. How is your heart?" "Hello, Indito," little Indian. He answered me in Castilla. I said to him, "Are you not Indian too? Maybe you are not Manuel, son of my Uncle Tomas, who is of our Indian race?" "Yes, I am Manuel, and I am the owner of that farm on the other side of the river. I am the owner of those cattle you see in the pasture. I am the owner of that land where the boys from the colonies go to make some money. But I am not Indian like you," he told me. "I do not know how to speak your language. My language is Castilla." Castilla is how in Chiapas, the words, and not just Chiapas, but Spanish. Isabella of Castilla. Queen Isabella was from Castilla. "Boy, do not say that my papa is your uncle. My family does not deal with Indians." I answered him, "Yes, your father is my uncle. Your father did the same work in the corn patch and planting beans as all the men of my race do." I told him, "Some years ago, your father also wore white cotton country clothes and sandals. Together, my father and he took candles to the festival of San Tomas." Then he laughed and said to me, "You stupid Indian, you are Catholic. That is why you are poor. You are wasting your time. It is from going off to pray that you have no cattle, no farm, or animals, or money. It is from going around praying that you do not know Castilla, and you speak your language that no one understands. Better stop praying. Get out of your colony that is so poor and come to my farm to make some money. Become Ladino, and you will see how you make money. Stop believing in God, because money is what is useful. Your God is of no use. God is money." When I heard all this that Manuel was telling me, I felt angry and sad. I told him I did not want to work on his farm. I have a special duty in my colony, and I told him goodbye. Along the road here, I kept thinking about many things, and I asked myself many questions like these. Is it true that we Indians, to be able to live comfortably, have to scorn our race? Is it true that to be able to grow, we have to forget our language and crush our brothers? In the colony, we do work for the community, school, pastures, paths, but we do not do it with pleasure. We do it out of fear and obligation. I believe that is because we do not like our race. We think the will of God is that we will always be poor. That is not so. God wants us all to get out of poverty together. Brothers, I believe in God, and I believe it is possible that with the work of all of us united, we may come to be a great people, a respected Indian people, where we may live as brothers. We must keep the wealth God gave us from rotting in the hands of the rich, or from being lost in the hands of those who are not capable of using it for the good of all. So I just want to then wrap up with a couple of thoughts that have helped me, or are helping me clarify my relationship to especially the three Abrahamic faiths. I'll share a story. I'm currently finalizing a manuscript, a book called Palestine 1492, a report back. And it begins with some journal entries from when I was living in Palestine, in Bethlehem in 2010 to 2011. And I was living just steps away from the Nativity Church, where they say Jesus of Nazareth was born. And I lived on Star Street, which is a street where the procession goes through every Christmas. And my neighbor, I was at my neighbor's little shop where she sold, candy, all the little things. And there were these two identical twin boys that come, 10 years old. And I was like, wow, twins. And she said, no, 3. She didn't know I didn't understand Arabic very much. So I was like, not 2. She's like, no, 3. Musa, Isa, Muhammad. That's their names. Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad. Those are the 3 prophets. Moses of Judaism, Jesus of Christianity, and Muhammad of Islam. And this is in Bethlehem, and this is a Christian family who named their triplet identical boys those names. And I only saw 2 of them at this. I never saw all 3, and sometimes I would only see one, and there was this one that would make faces at me and like throw things at me, and then like I'd fight back, And then almost 9 months later, I'm walking at night on Star Street, heading home. And I see the 3 of them coming at me, and I can't believe it. Oh my God, there really are 3. And then a little boy was with them. I was so focused on the 3, and I was like, well, we're walking, I don't know if this one's gonna throw something at me, like, are we just gonna pass? And then, instead of throwing something at me, he hands it to me, and it's a flower. And he introduces himself. His name is Muhammad. And I introduce myself as Kiki, and I meet the other 2, Isa and Musa. And we talk a little bit, and then I head out going home with my little flower, and I feel so happy that that I met all 3 of them, and that the interaction was very kind. And then as I'm walking away, one of the triplets picks up flowers from the ground, because I had asked, where did this flower come from? And they're like, it's Bella, trash. It's like, okay, cool, I still love the flower. And it turns out that someone had thrown some flowers on the ground, and as I'm leaving, one of the triplets picks up some flowers and starts throwing them at me. And it's Isa, it's Jesus. And I was like, oh, it's Jesus who's mad at me. All right. That makes sense. And I fight back. And then Muhammad picks up a flower from the ground and gives me a second flower. And I thought about that story recently because I'm putting it in my book, and in my diary entry, I was like so happy that I met all 3, and that Muhammad and Musa had given Isa a very good example of being nice. And that maybe next time Isa and I ever we confront each other, it will smile at each other. And many years later now, I can reflect on that and recognize that, I was able to smile at Jesus. I had met the Marxist Christians and the anarchist Christians, and they told me about a different Jesus, a revolutionary Jesus. And Palestinians understand Jesus also as revolutionary, as a martyr, as someone who died for their cause, for their life. And it made me realize that with religion, like with our movements, whether we call them secular or not, and it may be just because of the human condition that we're constantly being pulled toward this power over or power to. And this is in Islam. Also, a brother of mine in struggle, Muhammad Abdo, just came out with a book called Islam and Anarchism, where he's an example of this. There are the Jewish liberation theologians who are trying to fight back, have been trying to fight back against Zionism for decades, because they understand that as a fascist hijacking of Judaism. Just like with Constantine and the Roman Empire's co-optation of Christianity, They call Zionism a Constantinian Judaism. The empire hijacked it. So we have these tensions between empire and the earth. And so how are we going to meet each other, right? Who are fighting with the earth, for the earth, are of the earth rather than of empire. Frantz Fanon, great revolutionary thinker, wrote a book called The Wretched of the Earth. I think we also need to understand there is a wretched of the empire as well. And which one do we want to be? I'll leave it at that.